Our last speaker before lunch is Jack Schmidt. Jack is professor of watershed science and director of the Intermountain Center for River Rehabilitation and Restoration at Utah State University. He leads a research group focused on environmental management of large rivers and improving stream restoration practice. He studied restoration of the Colorado River downstream from Glen Canyon Dam for over 20 years and has co-authored the award-winning USGS book titled Dams and Rivers, a primer on downstream effects of dam and controlled flood in Grand Canyon. Please welcome Dr. Jack Schmidt.
Thanks. I am daunted to stand between you and lunch. I'll try to be efficient here. The center that I direct, based here at Utah State, seeks to advance the practice of stream restoration through the teaching of short courses to agencies and professionals, conducting applied research, and undertaking post-project monitoring. What I'm going to talk about today is drawn from the work of myself and graduate student and postdoc and other faculty colleagues at the center, and does draw from several decades of work throughout the West. I am going to broadly discuss examples from the Intermountain West, the Colorado Plateau, the Columbia Plateaus, and broadly the Basin and Range. And the essence of my talk is this, if you want to head to lunch. The rivers of the West have been profoundly changed. There isn't enough money, and there isn't a societal consensus to restore all of these rivers. We have to know what we're doing. We have to choose our targets for restoration appropriately. To improve the practice of stream restoration involves not only better natural science, but better public policy. We are spending a lot of money restoring rivers. The Central Utah Completion Act authorized $170 million to offset some of the adverse impacts of the Colorado River Storage Project. We spend a reasonable amount of money in the Rio Grande in New Mexico trying to restore and maintain Rio Grande silvery minnow habitat. A very large amount of money has gone into the maintenance and effort to return the elevations of the desert terminal lakes in western Nevada and to restore river function to the Truckee, Carson, and Walker rivers. Litigation in the Owens River has led to re-watering long previously dry sections of the Owens River. In the Colorado River Basin alone, each of these 4 large river programs are all focused on restoring or returning some sense of naturalness or endangered species population status to each of the parts of the main stems of the Colorado River Basin. And I've not even listed some of the programs focused on the smaller tributary watersheds, such as the Virgin River Collaborative Program. And we're now in the realm of international conversation about managing and restoring the Colorado Delta. This is big stuff. This costs a lot of money. If you add all this up, at least in relationship to the money I'm used to dealing with, this is a lot of money. We ought to know what we're doing. Now, I'm just a geomorphologist, but I work in a college dominated by ecologists, and so I painfully am told every month that what I do only matters a little bit to ecosystems. I know it, I get it. I understand and know words like competition and predation and non-native species and all that. But I am going to focus on the mantra of what creates and maintains the aquatic habitat of river ecosystems. And the mantra of my discipline is that river form is created and maintained by the flux of water and the amount and flux of sediment that moves through river systems, constrained to some extent by whether valleys are narrow or wide and what's changing at the downstream end, namely the base flow. And so the rest of my remarks are going to focus largely on water and sediment. Every river in our region is somewhere on this continuum between what we know or understand it once was and the worst it can possibly be. And the decision to go from the present somewhere towards the wild condition is a matter defined by science and public policy. And so I'm just going to briefly walk through some of the key steps that I think we have to walk through in deciding how to make an informed decision. When we decide what kind of a target to take ourselves back to, we also have to understand whether we're working in an ecosystem where small amounts of change in an effort towards restoration will affect relatively large measures of environmental improvement, what some call the easy policy decision or the low-hanging fruit. And when we're working in ecosystems where large amounts of investment don't give us much return, because that's a fundamental piece of restoration science that we need to share with policymakers. And then if we implement projects, we have to ask ourselves two questions. How did the design elements perform? And were the goals of the project achieved? And I'll assert that those are two very different questions. And I just use as an example the well-known whipping boy of channel restoration, the restored Uvas Creek near Gilroy, California, and the site about 6 months after the project was built. The project was built with an insufficient slope to transport the sediment flux delivered to the reach through the reach, and so the reach filled with sediment. So let's walk through these steps in the process quickly. We do need to understand the past, not because we aimlessly wish to restore the past, but we have to know how far our ecosystems have diverted from the past. I want to point out that it's not always possible to do this, and we do have to ask ourselves what time frame we want to talk about. But I do want to point out and remind us that our friends who pursue river restoration in Europe do not burden themselves with the concept of what was the wild landscape or the pre-disturbance landscape. They are never so naive as to bother with the word pre-disturbance. It doesn't mean anything on a continent where Roman society transformed large parts of the Mediterranean 2,000 years ago. And so river restoration is pursued on this planet without reference to pre-disturbance states in some continents. Now, the wild rivers of the Intermountain West are driven by the high rainfall regions that sit on the margins of the region. And I've colored each of these areas in blue. The largest rivers of the region all are exotic rivers. They carry the snowmelt and the excess precipitation from the surrounding Rocky Mountains, Sierra Nevada, and Cascades into the Great Basin or across the Colorado Plateau and then the Basin and Range or across the Basin and Range. They're all driven by water that doesn't come from the Great Basin. Somewhat smaller rivers do arise in some of the high headwaters of northern Nevada, the Blue Mountains of northeastern Oregon, the Mexican highlands of central Arizona, and the high plateaus of Utah. But the big rivers, I've put yellow diamonds at each river segment that is now a notable high-profile river restoration program, and they're all exotic rivers. They're all driven by water from somewhere else. The hydrology of the Colorado River in its lower end along the Arizona-California segment illustrates this. This is the annual flux of water in years before completion of Hoover Dam. And the amount of water that came out of the Rocky Mountains and crossed from Utah into Arizona and measured at Lee's Ferry is the same amount of water that entered the Gulf of California in Mexico. No new additions to water occurred downstream from the Rocky Mountain snowmelt. And that's the same pattern if you want to talk about the Truckee or the Walker, or you want to talk about smaller rivers that drain the surrounding mountain landscapes. But whereas it's possible to characterize the hydrology of the Colorado River because the gauging network went in before significant depletions, whether it's in the western rivers that drain the Sierra Nevada or it's a Rio Grande, the gauging networks came in after significant human activity, and we simply can't quantitatively describe those landscapes. By the late 1800s, New Mexico was filing lawsuits against Colorado for depleting the water, and Mexico was in international arenas claiming that the United States was adversely affecting their irrigation supplies in the El Paso Juarez Valley. And so it's a very hard story to tell in some places. We need to rely on lots of other data sources, and some of those data sources are quite humbling in telling us how much we have transformed our rivers. The lower Colorado River was navigable by sidewheel steamboats in the late 1800s to service mining claims and mining camps as far upstream as the Virgin River. Photography is a wonderful data source that is absolutely essential at setting restoration targets. In the Colorado River system, our photography goes back to the photographs of the second John Wesley Powell expedition. But these late 1800s photographs are essential at setting targets for the past. Now, we also need to understand the present river, and one important step is to understand the infrastructure and its timing. This, for the Colorado River system, is the rate of construction and addition of new reservoir storage in the drainage basin with time. This vertical axis is the volume of the reservoirs. This big step up here is the construction of Hoover Dam. This is the construction of Lake Powell and the other reservoirs of the upper basin. In relationship to the construction of reservoirs, this yellow line is the amount of water passing to Mexico. And you can see that with full reservoir construction, the only amount of water that passes to Mexico is what we must pass by international treaty. The point is, we are yet still trying to restore the lower Colorado River. In the Provo River, closer to home in Utah, the infrastructure history is the reverse of the Colorado River. It's the addition of water out of the Weber River system and out of the uppermost Duchesne River, which in fact augmented and added to flows in the Provo River that caused the need for future restoration. It has a very different history. This infrastructure changes the stream flow, and we have to adapt our restoration plans to an altered stream flow. On the Provo, this purple line is the flow duration curve after augmentation. That's how much I have left, right? Yeah. Is the augmented stream flow, and we've substantially increased the magnitude of the large flows in the system. We have to pass more water downstream. In contrast, in the Rio Grande, full depletion and development in the upper basin completely has separated the Big Bend region of the river from everything in the headwaters, such that everything that goes through Big Bend National Park now comes out of Mexico. And what goes on in New Mexico and Colorado has nothing to do with what goes down the river in Texas. We've completely segmented the system. On the Walker River in western Nevada, there are sections where the depletion and the consumption of water is nearly complete. Each of these solid lines is the hydrograph for a particular relatively drought year going into the Mason Valley near Urrington, Nevada. And the dashed line are the hydrographs for the same years leaving. Everything between these lines and these lines is the amount consumed by agriculture in the valley. Today, the question is, how do we get more water all the way through to Walker Lake? And in a system where the infrastructure and the environment is now adapted to this consumption of water, what sort of societal will do we have to now begin to pass more water downstream? We have to also understand the changes in the sediment supply, because a river is a river of sediment as well as a river of water. We think of river geomorphic form and balance as sort of the product of the balance between water, how much, its magnitude, and the amount and sizes of sediment that must be transported. When you either alter the sediment balance or the water balance, then you can trip a river into disequilibrium. We know that downstream of dams, we trap tremendous amounts of sediment. The width of these arrows is proportional to the pre-Glen Canyon Dam flux of sediment through Grand Canyon. The width of these arrows is the post-dam sediment flux. More than 95% of the sediment load through the park is now trapped in Lake Powell. And so what we do now downstream is significantly changed, or our options are very different. And yet, estimating sediment supply is very difficult. In Big Bend National Park, significant tributaries contribute sediment to the river. If we don't understand the magnitudes of these sediment supplies, we can't intelligently know what flows to call for out of Mexico, and yet understanding this is very difficult. And because of that difficulty, it's why sediment supply and sediment transport is the great ignored part of river restoration. We just wish it would go away. We do need to match photos and understand how much our rivers have changed. And so some photo matches of the Green River, much narrowed river in Browns Park downstream from Flaming Gorge Dam because of flow reduction. A matched photo in the Canyon of Lador in Dinosaur National Monument. It's a different river. A matched photo of the Rio Grande in Big Bend National Park. It's a different river. We need to understand the trajectory by which rivers went from their wild to their present condition. And we need to understand the distribution of those trajectories. And so I want to leave you with a basic model of how rivers respond downstream from dams and diversions. Below Elephant Butte Dam on the Rio Grande, the river incised its bed on the order of 150 kilometers downstream because the river was thrown into sediment deficit because of trapping of sediment up in Elephant Butte Dam. Further downstream, the river aggraded. This sediment went kerplop down here, and the river filled its bed. Further downstream, this is a shrinkage of the river between the 30s and the 70s. The river is a tiny shadow of its former self. Below Hoover Dam and Parker Dam on the lower Colorado, the same thing. Bed erosion near the dams, and red, bed aggradation further downstream. Both patterns can occur. So below dams, the problem is sediment evacuation. Further downstream, the problem is too much sediment. You've got to know what the problem is you're dealing with if you're going to restore the river. Now, to understand the linkages between flow, sediment supply, and transformation, there's lots of tools. There's just lots of tools. These are big floodplain excavations we've dug along the Rio Grande, in which we've documented more than 2 meters of floodplain, of loss of more than 2 meters of aggradation of the floodplain, of the channel from a buried gravel bar to now a floodplain in about 15 years of time. Current operations are still leading to the transformation of our rivers. If we're going to change things, we've got to understand the cost and benefits of what we propose doing. In Grand Canyon, we are spending a lot of money. This is a graph of time. Despite all of the money we're spending in Grand Canyon, the size and amount of sandbars in Grand Canyon is either getting smaller or is not changing despite substantial societal investment of money. Why? Because a river doesn't have enough sediment, and yet the only politically acceptable tool to restore sandbars is to use clear water floods to redistribute a tiny amount of sediment where we want it to be. That's a dicey proposition with difficult results despite all the publicity we get. Well, how do we decide where to work? At least in the Colorado River system, we have to advise policymakers on where to work, because every one of these river restoration programs in the basin affects hydropower production. And yet the entire watershed is linked by a regional electricity grid. And everything we do in one place affects what we do other places. So, we need to institute tools with which to think about the trade-offs of where we work. And so I've gone back to that balance diagram. The degree to which we've perturbed the water supply or the flood regime of rivers, and the degree to which we've perturbed the sediment supply. Here's no perturbation. If we greatly perturb the sediment supply and not the flood regime, we cause evacuation or accumulation. We can use some approaches to estimate the nature of the degree of perturbation, and this is a study in which in red are all the reaches that have been perturbed into sediment deficit and some sections that have been perturbed into sediment surplus. We've perturbed most all the rivers of the West. Each of these is a different segment of a river system in the West, and the distance these values are from this solid line is the degree to which we've thrown rivers into sediment deficit or surplus. Everything needs to be fixed. How do we decide what to do? In Grand Canyon, we actually know what the solution is, and we know what it would cost. It's been done, the analysis has been done by the Bureau of Reclamation. But the question is, do we have the will to do it? Here's how I like to think about the restoration problem. If we're a river here, thrown into sediment deficit, we could at least add some sediment supply and return the river to some sort of post-dam mass balance equilibrium. If we add sediment to a river in sediment deficit, we at least drive the river in a direction more towards the wild condition. But that comes at a cost. Similarly, if a river has too much sediment, we can add flood to it. That comes at a cost. We may not have the institutional commitment to do this everywhere. And it may be that you could take a river in deficit and take more water out of it and return it to mass balance equilibrium. You could take sediment out of a river with too much sediment. But what that does, it drives the rivers toward a miniature condition. This is a fundamental public policy decision we have ahead of us. And so we can look at the prescriptions and we can say, there's too much to do. We need a guiding image of what we want. On the Provo River, that guiding image is simple and straightforward and clearly articulated. The Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in eastern Oregon, we have a channelized river. Do we want to restore it for waterfowl? Do we want to restore it for red-band trout? Do we want to recreate what was there in the 1800s? It's not clear we know what to do. In Grand Canyon, the answer to developing a future is to put everybody at the table. Put all the stakeholders at the table. But what happens when you put all the stakeholders at the table? Every stakeholder gets to pick a goal. And the problem is, those goals either reflect relics of the pre-dam river or artifacts of what is there now. And I would submit you can't have both. But what happens in a place like Grand Canyon is in 2004 we run controlled floods to rebuild sandbars, a relic of the past, and then we run high fluctuating flows to disadvantage trout spawning in a reach where it's not desirable, and we erode the very same sandbars we built 3 months ago. We shoot each other despite all the money and smarts in the world. You'll look at every one of these programs and see that every one of these programs promises everything: to restore the world and maintain water delivery and hydroelectricity production. I would submit that we are disingenuous to the American public to tell them that they can have everything. I'm not going to talk about performance or restoration goals. I want to conclude by reminding us that part of our job is better tools with which to apply the ideas of how to restore channels. But part of better restoration is deciding where we work, and that this precious time in our society, when we have enough money to do the job, we ask ourselves, are we spending our money in the right place? We have the ability to recreate just about anything we want. We just have to decide what we want and where we want to do it. Thank you.
Go ahead and have one question.
Ron.
In your experience working in different systems, and you use Grand Canyon as an example of kind of a confused system because of some of the stakeholders, do you see a way through this public process phase to get groups in there that can ultimately have a goal? How does society move forward that?
Yeah, I don't know the answer. The question is, so what do you think we ought to do? There's a dynamic tension here. Every one of us who studied American water policy knows that in the 1950s, water policy was set in the United States by the well-known iron triangle of water development, construction companies, and the political establishment that supported that. It was a very small circle. The environmental community crashed the party with the fights over Echo Park Dam and stopping the dams in Marble Canyon. So in a sense, we've gotten what we want, a stakeholder-based decision-making. But the problem is, and this is quite cynical, but we start these darn stakeholder processes by getting to know each other and like each other and falling backwards into each other's arms and doing ropes courses and deciding to listen genuinely to what the other person says. And so we just want everybody to be happy. And so what we've ended up in Grand Canyon with is a list of objectives, which is everything. Restore the river to the way it was prior to closure of Glen Canyon Dam and maximize production of hydroelectric power. I mean, get it. That's not it. It is at least explicit. With the new administration, there's been a serious conversation off the record about whether these big adaptive management programs are working. CalFed is in crisis. The Trinity River Restoration Program is in crisis. Some of the big programs in the West are spending lots and lots of money with uncertain results. And I've heard people in the environmental community say, simplify this, get rid of all these stakeholders, let's know where the buck stops, and let them be advised by groups. But let's not have these big, cumbersome programs. I don't know that that's the answer, Ron. I think we are at a state where we thought that stakeholder-based decision-making was the answer. And in these big, complex programs, it's not the answer either. We'll probably live in dynamic tension for the rest of our lives.